In this video, we're going to be talking about the function Xlookup. So Xlookup is a relatively new function to Excel, just having been introduced in the last couple of years. Xlookup's predecessor, VLOOKUP, is the historic workhorse of looking up data. And we're actually going to look at that in the next video because it really is important to understand kind of the historical context and be able to look at models that use VLOOKUP. Xlookup is the new improved function though, so that's what we're going to focus on today. And this is really what you should focus on in models that you build going forward. You're going to still need to know things like VLOOKUP and index match to be able to understand other models that already exist. But Xlookup is really going to be the way to build your models as you are creating new models going forward. So let's bring up the function and see what arguments we need. So the first argument, just like we're going to use in like an index match, is that we need to know what to look up. So the lookup value in this case is going to be that borrower ID we've been talking about. The second argument it looks for is the lookup array. So the lookup array is where you want to look for that lookup value. The lookup value is the borrower ID, so we want to look it up in our borrower ID column. Be sure to lock those cells whenever we're referencing data. Our third element then, our third argument that the function asks for is the return array. So what data do we want back? Let's start out by getting back the loan amount. So we're making sure that our two arrays line up, right? We're going from B7 to B12 and E7 to E12. So those things match up. We look good. And at this point, all the rest of the arguments are in brackets. When they're in brackets, that means they're optional, so we don't have to include them. So we can hit close parentheses. And what we see is we get our loan amount of 8734. We can verify that that's the currency that matched. 8734, that looks good. All right, so that's the basic idea of Xlookup, is instead of having to do an index and a match separately like we did in the last video, Xlookup is going to take care of that for you without having to necessarily figure out how those two functions nest together. It's also very flexible in that we can now come in and change that last array that's going to give us the data that we want back, and we can move it, say, over to the state. And now we get the state associated with that borrower ID. So it's very flexible. We can move it back and forth. And so Xlookup gives us a lot of power in building these lookup functions without having to use that index and match together. It is worth looking at and knowing what the other arguments are, so let's look at that real quick. The next argument is if not found. All right, so what is happening here? Let me actually give you an example of what happens traditionally if you don't find what you're looking for. For example, borrower ID 43237 is in the data. Borrower ID 12345, it's not in our data set. And so when we ask Xlookup to find it, we get the hashtag NAR. NARs typically mean that it's not finding what it's looking for. And so that's what you should be thinking first off when you see these errors, particularly with things like index match or Xlookup or VLOOKUP. So in this case, it tells us it didn't find anything. Well, maybe we don't want to see that and we want to get a more descriptive message back. Well, that's where the if not found comes in. So if it doesn't find something, normally it gives you that hashtag NAR. Instead, we can say no such borrower ID. We can just give a customized message. That way the user kind of says, oh, okay, I know what's happening now. The function has been programmed to give me a little bit more information back. So that's that fourth argument. The fifth argument then is going to be the match mode. Match mode is whether you're doing exact matching or approximate matching. We are focusing on exact matching for right now. So if you want to put an argument in here, you put in 0 for the exact match. That is the default, so if you leave it blank or don't put that argument in, it's going to assume exact matching. And then the last argument is how you want to search. And this is an important thing to understand about these lookup functions, match included, VLOOKUP included, is when they start searching for that borrower ID, right? They're searching over here in column B. They traditionally start from the top and work down. And they find the very first instance of that borrower ID. So that's why it's important to know that your borrower IDs are unique in a column if that's what you are expecting. If there are multiple borrower IDs, it's not going to get to that second one. However, Xlookup is built to actually search from the bottom up as well. Instead of searching first to last, you can search last to first, so searching up from the bottom, and then you would get the last instance. And that way you could actually check if you have multiple instances of the same borrower ID. These are advanced options. We're not going to use them for now. I just want you to be aware of them. So you can just go ahead and put a 1 in there. That's the normal option. And in this case, the function's going to work just like we expected. We can put our old 76352 in here. Whoops, 76352. We get our loan amount for Claire back. And you notice nothing really changed there. So what we could do is, again, we can go back, we can delete these last 3 arguments, and it's not going to change how the function works for us and how we're using it today. Again, we'll talk about those more advanced options later on in the semester when we get there. Just like with index match, with Xlookup, we do have to be careful about how our arrays are aligned. So let's look at that real quick and what can go wrong. In this case, Xlookup is a little bit more robust in that if we set it up to where one array contains the header and the other one doesn't, so we have a little bit of a mismatch that way, we're going to get a hashtag value error. So the value error is letting us know there's something wrong in the function, that it's not going to work properly. And in this case, it's because it's trying to compare these 2 arrays that are different sized. Right? So it's going to give you a warning. So it's nice. Index match will not give you that warning. Right? It'll actually give you an answer that might look correct, well, it's actually not going to be. Xlookup is superior in that it's actually going to give you a warning that, hey, stop and figure out what's wrong with the function. Where it's not going to give you any help is if you actually stagger the 2 arrays. So if they're the same size, but we accidentally stagger them, right? So one is above the other, now we're actually going to start seeing mismatches. So in this case, we can see that 76352 is the second borrower ID, and it's pulling the second loan amount of the array that it's looking in. Right? It's pulling the second entry of that loan amount array. And so because we've staggered it, we're now getting off by 1 in our answer. So we really have to be careful to make sure that these arrays are always lining up. Xlookup handles different sized arrays for us and gives us an error message, but it won't handle staggered arrays. So we really need to watch out and be careful about that.